All right. Right. So, our topic this term, there is a book which we're studying from. It's called The Great Realizations. Could you please put up your hand if you do not have this book? Okay. So what I'd suggest is after class, if they have about 20 or 30 copies downstairs in the bookstore. So if you could get your copy, this is what we'll be studying from. If you don't want to buy it, there may be a few copies in the library, so you can borrow it from the library once you apply for a library card. So you're welcome to do that as well. I'm not sure the price. I think it's probably about between... 23. Is it that much? Okay. 23. Okay. So that's the book that we'll be studying from. The other book that we're studying from is this one. It's called The Core Teachings. So this is by Venerable Master Xing Yin. So for those of you who don't know, Master Xing Yin is our founder. He founded the Foguanshan Temple, so he is our the head of our order, I guess you'd call it. Foguanshan has about 300 temples around the world. This is the main temple for the Toronto area. Our main temple is in Taiwan. Venerable Xing Yin, he's 88. He's getting up there. So his health is not so good, but he still teaches. He still is very active, and he, over his lifetime, he has done an awful lot of writing. And it's only really within maybe the last 10, 20 years that a lot of what he's written has been available now in English. So we're kind of lucky to have it. So we'll be studying from this book as well. So it's called The Core Teachings, and that'll be available downstairs also. Okay. Now I assume from the show of hands so far that not too many people have done the advanced reading that you were asked to do. So am I right in that? Put up your hand if you actually have read the first 23 pages in this book that were asked. Not too bad. Okay, so you guys have to help me out. So, this is a commentary on a particular what's called a sutra. Right? So if you're not familiar with the term sutra, that is basically the Buddhist scriptures. Right? So these are the words that the Buddha spoke. Right? So this is what he taught. And what he said was memorized, it was passed down from generation to generation, eventually written down. You guys are familiar with the word suture, I'm sure. So suture actually comes from the same root word, because when the sutras were originally written down, they were actually, they're not nicely bound like this or glued or whatever, they were stitched together. The pages were stitched together, so that's where the word sutra comes from. So for those of you who have been here previous terms, this term is a little bit different because we're studying a sutra as opposed to just studying particular topics or a commentary or a textbook or that kind of thing. So we're studying a sutra, right? So for a lot of people, this might be your first time doing that. And it is a little bit different than just a typical course syllabus, right? Because what we're actually doing is going to the source, right? We're going, and we're still working with commentaries, we're still working with trying to explain it, but it's really going to the source. And because of that, especially if you're a Buddhist, you treat a sutra differently than you would just a general textbook or another book that you might be reading. So for one thing, we treat the sutras with respect, the actual text, right? We treat it with respect, right? So in a traditional arrangement, we'd actually, before even reading a sutra, we would actually sit, we would dress in robes, we would, sit in a proper posture. Pardon me? Shower beforehand, exactly, right? So there's a number of preliminaries even that you would do. Right? We're not asking you guys to do that, right? But if that's your practice, please continue it, but if not, you don't have to. However, please don't read it while you're eating, right? And get peanut butter all over it or something, and don't. And even if you mess up your copy, if you need to throw it out, please don't just throw it in the garbage, right? You can bring it here; it'll be disposed of properly here. Actually, when I was coming into the temple the other day, I found there's little pamphlets, little booklets that you guys might have seen downstairs, and these are by Master Xing Yin. And I actually found one of these out in the rain the other day. Someone had just left it outside on the steps. And I brought it in, right, and gave it to the front desk staff, and they were kind of, the lady was kind of horrified when she saw it. It's like, oh my goodness, like, you know, and it was like I'd found like a dead baby or something. But we do treat the words with respect, right? And even if you're not a Buddhist, if you do that, it actually just helps you, puts you in the right frame of mind. And that really, you know, when we study sutras, the frame of mind is probably the most important thing. So like, you know, we clean ourselves, we sit properly, we respect it. We don't let the sutra touch the ground, for example, like we make sure that it's taken care of, right? And the reason for that is not really anything to do with the sutra. If you look at it, I mean, it's just a book, it's just a piece of paper. But in our minds, if we treat it as something worth taking care of, then it actually helps in taking care of us. So. All right, now this sutra in particular is the 8 Realizations Sutra, or the 8 Realizations of a Bodhisattva. So we're going to start with that. I know not all of you have read the introduction. The introduction is actually really interesting. It talks about where the sutra comes from, kind of who it was intended for, things like that. So we'll get to that in a minute. But what I want to talk about is when we talk about a bodhisattva. So a lot of people may not be familiar with that term. Bodhisattva is translated as a great being, right? So they're distinguished from ordinary beings. And a bodhisattva is someone who has kind of taken as their task to enlighten all beings, to save all beings from suffering, to help others to reach enlightenment themselves so that they can help others reach enlightenment as well. Now what I'd like to do is just split up into small groups. And I want to make sure if you have read the introduction, please get yourself in a group with people who haven't. Other facilitators for the class, please make sure there's at least one facilitator per group. And what I want to do is talk about the first question. So I know that those of you who are new, you haven't studied, you don't know the Buddhist definition of what a bodhisattva is. But have a discussion about, you know, what do you think a great being is, right, as opposed to an ordinary being. And here's the important part, which are you, right? So are you a bodhisattva? Are you a great being? Or are you an ordinary being? And we'll see sort of what comes out of that. So just organize yourselves into groups, maybe 5 or 6 people each. Again, if you don't have the handout, please put up your hand until Martin gives you one. Just hold it up so that you can see. And just get yourselves in a group. We'll only go for like maybe 5 to 7 minutes of discussion, but please organize yourselves and talk about the first question in the handout. Okay, so what is a bodhisattva? What is a great being? What did you guys talk about? No wonder no one put up their hand when I asked who was a bodhisattva. Did you have a great answer? What's your great answer?
I was referring to a talk that I listened to, and Bodhi means awakening, and Sattva means being or sentient beings. So those 2 words together in this talk said it could mean one of 3 things. It could mean a being who's in awakening others. It could mean a being who's in the process of awakening, or it could be the actual process of awakening manifested as a being.
Deep. Very good. Does anyone else have anything to add? Yeah.
We all discovered that we are really great beings inside. But it's our delusions that keep us from finding out.
Oh. So why didn't you put up your hand then? When I asked... That's a great answer. Yeah, please.
Because I raised my hand.
I was going to get to you, but yes.
Yeah, I think that Buddha is in every person. It's just a question of how you live your life. That's the purpose of everyone being here. But I want to say from a different perspective. My native language is Russian, which comes also from the Aryan source from the Sanskrit. It has a relationship So the word Buddha exists a little bit in a different way in Russian language, and it means two things. The first thing, it means to be, just to exist. And also it exists as to be awakened. So you want to awaken someone, you use the verb as in its core, the verb Buddha. So I think, and in some other languages will probably have the core like, I would say the verb to be, and this be is also probably comes from somehow related to Buddha. So it's to be yourself, and looks like we are not ourselves, at least myself. I don't feel that I'm doing something different from I really want to be. So that's why I wish to become even a little closer to some great people.
Right. Okay, excellent. So, whether you consider yourself a bodhisattva, whether you consider yourself an ordinary person, some people consider themselves, sometimes I'm a bodhisattva, sometimes an ordinary person. It just depends. Or maybe I'm a bodhisattva on the inside, but when it comes to actually expressing it, maybe I don't do so well. I kind of think that most people are bodhisattvas who haven't quite reached their potential. But however you do it is kind of up to you, right? When I took refuge, taking refuge is when you actually become a Buddhist. So I became a Buddhist 2005. Master Shinyan, our founder, was here to do the ceremony. And he gave a little talk after the ceremony was over, and he said to us that we should think of ourselves as Buddhas, right? Not just bodhisattvas, but as Buddhas. And he actually made us recite, I am a Buddha, right? And if that was actually true, then I wouldn't have to be a Buddhist anymore. I'd just be a Buddha. I'd go off into nirvana. Everything would be fine, right? So obviously, I'm not at that stage. No one was at that stage, having just taken refuge. But why do you think he would have us say, I am a Buddha, declare I am a Buddha?
It's part of your nature, I guess. It's innate in you. Right?
Do you think anyone in that room would then say, okay, well, I'm done? So what is it when I say I am a Buddha? What am I doing?
Follow the Buddha's path, try to reach the God.
Yeah. And I think very much what Alistair said, like that nature is within me. I just have to overcome all the obstacles that are standing between me realizing it, right, and whatnot.
Remove the dust from the mirror.
Removing the dust from the mirror. So so it's kind of like declaring an intention, right? It's declaring sort of, it's true, but it's not quite manifested, right? And it's the same thing here, right? And this is where we get into the kind of the difference between sort of what a sutra study is and just what ordinary studying is, right? Because what we're actually trying to do is not just learn from the sutra, we're actually trying to set our minds into a certain state. And one of those things is if we say I am a bodhisattva, right, that kind of opens up a certain set of possibilities for us. Right? If we say I'm an ordinary person or I'm just an ordinary person, then I think our possibilities are much more limited. Right? So it's much more, if you want to be on the path, if you want to progress, it's much better to say I am a bodhisattva. Right? Because then now, from that intention and from that declaration, I can now see, are my actions consistent with that? Are my thoughts consistent with that? Or are they not? And almost immediately we'll all find that no, not quite. So it kind of gives us a direction, it gives us something to work on. Whereas if we just say, I'm an ordinary person, then, well, I can dabble if I want to. Right? I can explore this, I can think about it. Every once in a while I can try to help other people, or I can, think about enlightenment or stuff like that. But I'm just an ordinary person, so I'm doing really well if just occasionally I kind of dabble with being a bodhisattva, right? So if you're serious about setting your mind on this path, then the first step, I think, is knowing that you are a bodhisattva, that you do have that nature, right? That you might have a lot of things to overcome, that you might have a lot of obstacles, but ultimately that's who you are, right? And that's who you want to be, right? So that's kind of the first step. So, which is why we talk about it first. And just to review, so we talk in Buddhism about 3 trainings. I won't take a lot of time on this, but it's a concept that you should be aware of, right? So whenever we talk about the Buddha's teachings, right, they kind of fall into 3 categories, right? So one of them is morality, right? And we usually say that's the first one, that you have to act, you know, in a non-harmful way to other people. You have to act for people's good. You have to avoid violating, you know, other people, right? And we have what are called the 5 Precepts, which kind of define at a basic level Buddhist morality, right? So no killing, no stealing, no lying, no sexual misconduct, no intoxicants. So if you're a Buddhist, if you're taking refuge, the next vow that you would take is the 5 Precepts. And that kind of sets our sort of moral ground that we stand on, right? It defines sort of what actions we should take, what actions we shouldn't take, and whatnot. And the Buddha taught morality as part of the teachings. So that's kind of the first pillar, if you like, of Buddhist teachings. Second one is meditation, right? Or meditative concentration, as we sometimes call it. And that is, it's meditation, right? It's sitting down, it's learning to clear your mind, it's learning to focus and concentrate, moving out the distractions, that kind of thing. So it's less sort of what you're doing day to day, but it's how you set your mind. Right? Which is why, you know, we have meditation before we have the class, is because it helps to clear your mind, it helps you to be in a more receptive frame of mind before we move on. And then the third one is wisdom, right? Wisdom training, which is really the not just the knowledge, but kind of like, you know, it's the view that we have of everything, right? The view of the world, right? And is it true or not true, right? And so we train in that. A sutra covers all 3, right? So you can take the sutra, and you can say, this is a guideline for how I should live, right? For moral behavior, for how I should act with other people, with my relationships, with, you know, my job, with my family, with people I meet on the street. This is a good guide, right? And you can take it and you can study it that way, right? You can also take it and say, this is a guide for meditation, right? So when I sit down to meditate, I'm going to use these 8 points as my focus, right? And I'm going to meditate, I'm going to take this as meditation instruction. Or you take this as wisdom, right? And the sutra is giving you concepts, it's giving you a way to look at the world, and it's giving you knowledge and a viewpoint which is consistent with what the Buddha taught, right? So a sutra, you can take it all 3 ways, right? And depending on where you are, you might only look at one. But as we go through this term, I would encourage you to think of it in all 3 ways, right? Depending on what you need most, right? So, especially for the first realization that we're talking about today, this is something that we often just look at as knowledge, right? We look at it as, this is just what the Buddha taught, I'm going to learn some facts, I'm going to learn kind of the concepts and that kind of thing, and maybe I can apply it later. But really we should be looking at this as not just knowledge, not just as even wisdom, but something that will help guide us in our thoughts, will help guide us in our actions. So, all right. Now for those of you who read the introduction, it talks a lot about the history of the sutra, right? So, does anyone know when it was written, approximately? So on page 14, right, so the translator was a Parthian monk, An Shigao, arrived in China at 148 AD, or Common Era. All right, so it was basically, I guess about 500 years after the Buddha died that this sutra was actually translated into Chinese. Is that better? There we go. Much better. Can anyone tell me who it was intended for?
For lay people.
For lay people. Right, so there's lots of sutras that help to instruct the monks, the monastics. This was actually intended for lay people. Right? And it was actually intended, according to the introduction, it was intended for beginners. Right? So we kind of think, it's a sutra, it's kind of, this is going to be hard, this is going to be difficult. This was actually intended for people who are just learning Buddhism. Right? It was intended to introduce Buddhism to the Chinese people. Right? And it is comprehensive in the sense that it really contains everything that the Buddha taught is covered. Right? So everything that you need to know about Buddhism is in this very short sutra. But at the same time, it's really intended to help people who are new to Buddhism come to terms with it. Right? Now, it's not for people who are just kind of casually interested. It is for serious seekers. Right? But if you're seriously interested in learning Buddhism, this is an excellent place to start. I used to think that, given that we have some new students in the class, that this is maybe a bit difficult. Right? This is maybe not the thing to start with. Right? Especially the first realization is very difficult to understand. There's a lot of new concepts in it, terminology. It can be quite challenging. Right? But at the same time, once you're past that, then it really is intended to be something that everyone can benefit from. So, the other thing that is important about the sutra, and by the way, this the first realization we're talking about, I'm just introducing the sutra for the first part of this. We'll get to the first realization for the rest of today and next week. So I've got 2 weeks with you guys. But the last thing before we get into the actual sutra itself is talking about how it should actually be used. Right? And it says in the first verse, if we can just look at the sutra, first of all. So for all disciples of the Buddha, each morning and night, recite with a sincere mind these 8 realizations of a bodhisattva. So it's saying not just to study it, not to just read it, but actually to recite it, to chant it. And can anyone guess to the reason as to why that might be? Why would it be so explicitly stated right at the beginning that this should be chanted, not just studied, not just read, not just understood, all the other terms that we might use with the sutra, but specifically morning and night we should take the sutra and we should chant it?
I'll try to give you an answer, Rick.
Sure, please.
It's almost a form of meditation, with chanting. It calms and steadies your mind, as I say. And for me, when you're doing that, especially when I'm doing chanting and it's in yin, it truly makes me focus.
Right.
I have to focus on everything. So the other things that it says in the book that I didn't really think of, or wouldn't think of, is it says it brings peace, and it constantly reminds you of the Dharma when you chant. Those 4 reasons.
Great. Thank you. Ryan.
It can also contribute as a positive habit to have in daily living. And it says specifically each morning and night, because the easiest time we might feel is the time to practice is first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Everything else in between might be our jobs, just running around, being very busy with our minds not being focused, but at least planting that seed of a sort of intention with chanting it in the morning to help us become slightly better people in the middle of the day, and then to reinforce that habit last thing at night is usually a very good way of cultivating that positive habit of chanting it.
Okay, excellent. Anyone else? So do you see how those relate to the 3 trainings? Scott's answer, Ryan's answer. All right, so what Scott was talking about was meditation. What Ryan was talking about was sort of guiding our habits, guiding our behavior, right, which relates to morality, right? And obviously wisdom in terms of the content of the sutra as well, and trying to hold that in our mind, right? Just in terms of meditation, I read an article recently. So it talks about, in the last verse, talks about keeping the realizations in your mind, keeping all 8 realizations in your mind at all times. How many things can we think of at one time? 1? Any other answers? Yep.
Trillions.
Trillions, maybe somewhere in between. So we know it's either one or trillions or somewhere in between. Good, we're on the right track.
See, we're leading you to the middle way.
There we go. There's actually a lot of research, scientific research, that's been done in this. There used to be sort of a theory, and it was based on psychological experiments. People would be shown, like, certain numbers of things, whether they're numbers or colors or words or whatever, and they'd be asked to recall them. And for a long time, the answer was 7. Right? So you could hold 7 things in your mind at the same time. Right? And whether that's a series of numbers or colors. Think about a telephone number. Right? The reason why telephone numbers are often 7 digits is because people thought makes it, any more than that makes it hard to remember. Right? But there are people obviously that can remember more than 7 things because, but they use memory tricks, right? So they use like associations, they use other things to try to do that, and they can remember hundreds of things maybe. But in terms of sort of our natural mind, they said it was 7. Some research came out in 2008, said, no, it's not 7. That was kind of like, that's kind of using some associations and that kind of thing. It's really 4. There are some people who think that it's 1, but, we might think that we're thinking of 2 things at the same time, but we're just kind of switching back and forth really, really quickly. Right? So maybe it's 1. Right? Here we're being asked to hold 8 things in our mind at the same time. Right? So it's a bit of a stretch for most of us. Right? And if you think about it, just look at, hold up your 2 fingers. Right?
At the same time.
and just move your attention to, move your awareness to one of the fingers, and then try to hold the other one in your mind at the same time. Try to have your attention on both fingers at the same time. And just try to imagine, is your attention in, on both fingers? Are you kind of like vibrating back and forth? Are you kind of focusing on one more than the other? Right, so it kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Now, we're not trying to focus just on fingers, we're trying to focus on some actually very complex ideas and concepts when we study the sutra. So, chanting is a way to help to do that, right? To become familiar with them and whatnot, and actually help us keep them in our minds, right? And eventually, maybe we start with 1, maybe we move on to that to 2, maybe eventually we can hold all 8 of them in our mind at the same time, right? Which sounds exhausting, right? What we actually find as we become more and more familiar with the sutra is that it doesn't take really as much effort. Right? When we talk about things like lessening desire, for example, right? So that's one of the points is that desire, excessive desire brings suffering. Right? So normally when we desire something, we think that desiring something, it actually brings pleasure as opposed to suffering. Right? So our mind is already going one way. We're just trying to switch it to go another. Right, so once these things become more natural, then we don't have to hold them in our mind quite as closely. They just become sort of our natural habit. Okay? But chanting is important, especially when we're first introduced to this, and sort of as we study it, it's important to do chanting. So this is something that when we've studied the sutra in the past, we've actually asked people, when you go home tonight, right before you go to bed, chant the sutra. When you get up tomorrow, chant the sutra. Do this every day, right? And just see how it goes. See what difference it makes. Does it change your actions during the day? Does it help your concentration, right? Does it help in other ways, right? So it's kind of like an experiment. So that's your homework assignment, right? Is chant the sutra when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night. Just takes about 2 minutes, and chant it. Yes, you have a question?
May I just ask, are we going to practice the chanting so we can learn how to do it?
Absolutely. So, and I didn't ask her to say that. That was just a natural lead-in. So we're going to chant it. So does everyone have a copy of the sutra? Right? For anyone who doesn't, it's also at the beginning of the book, or you can share or whatnot. Now, the absolute best way to do this, right? We won't talk about getting dressed in robes or taking showers beforehand. If you want to, that's great. If you have a daily meditation practice, right, where you just sit and you do sitting meditation, then do this right after that. Right? If you don't do daily meditation practice, start. But so just reciting is an act of concentration in itself, right? Just because we're trying to listen to the person beside us, we're trying to all keep together, that kind of thing. It's actually much easier if you come to the Sunday chanting, because it's done with instruments and whatnot, and it's much easier to stay together. It's harder when it's just reading, right, as opposed to reciting, as opposed to chanting. But unfortunately, we don't have chanting set up for this, so we read it. Any comments or impressions or thoughts having done that? Yes.
Some of the concepts towards
Right. So for now, don't worry if you don't understand a particular term or the language or whatnot, different concepts. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it right now, because we are studying each of these verses through the rest of the term. If you want to read ahead, that's absolutely fine. Go ahead. So if there are concepts that elude you that you're curious about, then go ahead and read about them. They're organized in the book, quite easy to find and logically. Any other comments? Yes.
Just if you happen to purchase the core teachings in the bookstore, so it's the other fundamental text that we work with here, there is a glossary at the back of the book which talks about different terms that you may find and will describe what those terms mean.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yes.
Aware of any resource, like, for example, the chanting at the temple courses in Mandarin, and the way it's chanted would have a different rhythm. Is there a source somewhere to hear what it would sound like chanting in English? Because the rhythm would be a little different to hear what it would sound like. Hard to find English.
Yeah. Not that I'm familiar with.
Not even know.
There is some stuff on YouTube, a lot of it, but there is some chanting, and for those of us who have been here for a while, hearing it chanting in English is just sort of weird. It's like Catholics when they stop doing Mass in Latin, right? It just seems pedestrian, but but there are some stuff in here.
Well, there is, for example, I've heard the Heart Suture chanted in English. There's a particular Zen group, and that recording is available. If you look for Heart Suture in English on YouTube or whatever, you'll probably find it that way. But not for this. And part of the reason for that, it's actually quite hard, it's quite difficult, right? Because obviously this didn't originate in English, right? It originated in, Parthian, whatever, moved into Chinese, etc. In order for it to be chanted to music or to a particular, like to an instrument, for example, it would have to be, like it's not easy to chant those particular words in those order, like it actually has to be retranslated in order to be able to have the cadence go correctly, right? But at the same time, you can't change the translation without changing the meaning, so it's very difficult to actually get a translation which, first of all, you can chant, and second of all, stays true to the original meaning of the text. So that's why it's not just a simple matter to do. But someday, come back in 50 years, I'm sure we'll be chanting everything in English by then. So.
But even the chanting, the Chinese version, half of it, it's even the mantra, like we can chant, but it's not Chinese word. And in the beginning when I started, we couldn't follow at all because I don't read the writing, I don't know, and then the sound, the meaning, I don't know. But then if you do it like after 3-4 months, it just comes automatically. And then on the other side, even the Chinese translation, because out of respect, they don't translate the mantra part. Yeah.
So, really, I learn something every day too. So.
I guess for now, just make the best
Yeah.
you have.
Right. So if you, and please do, if you do recite this, when you get up, when you go to bed, at first it'll feel a little weird. As you become more familiar with the words, then the chanting part gets easier, the reciting part gets easier. right? Which means that then you'll start to focus more on the words and the meaning of the words, right? So, and from there into sort of deeper meaning, etc. So don't expect it to be like, nirvana right away kind of thing, right? But keep up the practice, right? And eventually you get more comfortable with it, you get more familiar with it. And then when you come to it again, when you come to study it, it's very natural, right? So like a lot of the words are no longer unfamiliar, the concepts are kind of there, and you've made friends with it, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind chanting the Chinese because at the bottom there's always the English translation.
Mm-hmm.
But can someone tell me if is this sutra? Where is the Chinese part of it?
It's in the back of the book.
Is it in the back?
Yeah. The actual Chinese characters and translation in Chinese are in the back.
Yeah.
So on page 142.
142. Okay. So if you'd rather do the chanting in Chinese, if you're more comfortable with that, then of course that's fine. Okay. So does anyone have any questions about the sutra in general or anything that we've talked about so far before we move specifically to the first realization? Okay. So just having done that, that's for a lot of people that might be your first time reading through, right? So a lot of new concepts and a lot of new ideas. And again, just relax. Okay? There's nowhere to be, there's no sort of knowledge that you're already supposed to have, that kind of thing. It's new, but just relax into it. It's fine. Just enjoy the ride. So let's talk about the first realization. So Master Xinyan talks about the sutra being divided into two sections, right? The first being the first realization, and the second section being the other seven, right? And he talks about how this first stanza, this first realization, it really covers the Buddha's worldview. Right? It talks about how the Buddha encourages us to see the world. Right? And then the other 7 sections talk about, well, now that we see the world that way, what do we do with it? Right? How do we react? How do we act? So this one really, it's covering a lot of sort of very maybe difficult concepts to come to terms with if you're not familiar with them. If you were here last term, we actually talked about most of them in a different context. But if you're new to them, then we'll kind of cover them the best we can. So let's just read the first realization again. Can I have a volunteer to read the first realization? Please.
Oh, yes. The first realization. First realize that this world is impermanent and that nations are dangerous and fragile. The 4 great elements lead to suffering and are empty, and the 5 aggregates are without self. All things arise, cease, change, and become different. They are illusory, not real, and cannot be controlled. The mind is the source of all unwholesomeness, and the body is the gathering of wrongdoings. Contemplate this, and you will gradually turn away from the cycle of birth and death.
Thank you. Okay, so there's a number of terms here that you might not recognize, right? So when we talk about the 4 great elements, right? So let's just do a bit of a glossary first before we get into any of the concepts. So when we say 4 great elements, what do we mean by 4 great elements? Yep.
Isn't that like fire, wind, water, earth?
Right.
Yeah.
So fire, air or wind, earth, and water. Thank you. So in kind of a worldview, you could say, like, these are kind of like the 4 elements. Everything is composed of these 4 elements, right? There's no physical form that does not contain these four elements. So if you talk about our bodies, you can see, we have flesh, which is related to earth, solid, right? Water, so blood and other liquids, right? So we have the liquid element. Fire, so we have heat, our bodies generate heat, right? And air, we have breath, right? So we say that our bodies are composed of these four elements, right? And they also they correspond to like four physical states, right? So solid, liquid, gas, and energy, if you like. Okay, the five aggregates. Who's familiar with the five aggregates? They're also called the five skandhas. Ryan.
Form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness.
Okay, so these are five things. What are they collectively? What do they represent?
Form talks about the body, and the other four relate to the mind.
Okay, and body and mind together relate to what?
Self.
The self, right? So when we talk about self in Buddhism, we're talking about these five aggregates: the body and the mind, right? So the body is our physical form composed out of the four elements, right? And the other four, so feelings, perceptions, mental formations or thoughts, and consciousness, comprise the mind, right? So this is just a way of categorizing ourselves, right? And we'll get to that as well, mainly next week. Are there any other specific terms here that are confusing or that you want to talk about? Yep.
Just one footnote in the handout. It's actually, on the second page, the last paragraph about matter, where it says that, the last thing, it's a typo, I'm sure. It says of the five aggregates, 4 of them are physical and 1 mental.
Right, so it's the other way around.
So it's actually the reverse. 1 is physical and 4 are mental.
Thank you. Okay. So there's actually, in this verse, there's 4 main concepts that are being introduced. Okay. And these are often talked about as contemplations, things that we should contemplate. Okay. So we have the ideas of impermanence, no self, emptiness, and suffering. Right, so these 4 things are really the 4 elements of the worldview. I'll sit back down. When we talk about the worldview that the Buddha is holding, that the Buddha is describing, it's really modeled around these 4 things in this verse. So the first thing we should talk about is impermanence. Right? So those of you who were here last term, we had a class on impermanence. So there's a number of things that we need to realize about it. So who can tell me about impermanence? When we talk about impermanence in Buddhism, what are we talking about? Len.
Everything out of the universe changes, winds, and finally ceases.
Right. So every phenomenon rises, abides, and declines, and ceases. Right? So is that true? Anyone disagree? Is there anything that doesn't arise, abide, decline, and cease? Right. So in Buddhism, there is nothing. So when we say phenomenon, what are we talking about? What are some examples?
Winter.
Any thought or action?
I don't know about that one, actually.
Any thought or action of a being?
So our thoughts, right? So our thoughts, they arise, they abide for a while, they cease, right? Winter, so seasons, right? So the season starts, the season hangs around for a while. Sometimes it hangs around longer than it's really welcome, and then ceases. What else? Our bodies, same thing. What else?
The universe.
The universe, right? It seems like it's around for a long time, but it's still impermanent, right? Yeah.
It sounds like it's permanent. The process itself is permanent. If we call this rising and ceasing as a process,
Right.
it's always there. It doesn't
is it really a phenomenon then? Right? It's just that's kind of just a natural, it's kind of the condition that we live in, right? But it's not really a thing.
So it's also a quality. It's a quality of the thing. Without that thing, there's no quality to be applied. So it's still dependent on something that's always going to change.
Oh, how about things like our job, our family, our health, our cars, like all our physical possessions, our memories, right?
Suffering or joy.
Suffering and joy.
Anything you can be proud of.
There you go. Right? So this actually has a very kind of personal meaning as well. So we can kind of go from like the cosmological side of things, like the universe, right? Which is, for all intents and purposes, the universe is probably not going to end tomorrow. We're probably okay for a little while.
It seems like a
But
long time to us.
it does, right? And no matter how long, when we think of, in other religious traditions, if we think of like eternity, we think of heaven, right? And sort of we're there forever. If you really kind of like try to wrap your head around that, it becomes very difficult and very strange kind of quickly. So everything ceases, right? And that applies to mental phenomena, it applies to physical phenomena, right? And the importance of this teaching. So all of us kind of realize this, right? Like if we look at it, the more we think about it, the more we analyze it, there's really nothing that we can think of that's permanent, right? Everything has an origin, everything ceases eventually, whether it's in like milliseconds or whether it's over billions of years, right? And every time I ask this, I asked already, but every time I ask this, like, there are no exceptions, right? No one can think of an exception. The more you think about it, there are no exceptions to this. So what? Why is this important? Why is realizing this important? Right? Do we normally crave and cling? Right? If we realize that everything that we want, everything that we're trying to grasp, everything that we want to have is impermanent, do we want it as much? Or are we as attached to it? Right? The reason why we suffer, like, when people start thinking about impermanence, right? And by the way, if you're still not planning to attend the panel this afternoon on death, you notice how we try to avoid impermanent things, right? We try not, if we know it's impermanent, we still, we try to avoid it, right? Or we pretend that it doesn't exist, right? So no, I'm not going to go to a panel on death, thank you very much, right? That's depressing. Right? And if we really start thinking about things like impermanent, when we think about, that, eventually I'll die, my family, my grandchildren, everyone will be gone in 100 years, right? The planet will crash into the sun and it'll end, right? Everything that I'm doing will eventually cease, right? Decay, cease. So we get depressed, right? We get upset, right? We try to avoid it. We try to pretend it doesn't exist, or we just get so depressed that eventually we just give up and say nothing matters. If that's how you react, what is happening to you is not impermanence. What's happening to you is attachment, right? Because what we're actually doing is, rather than looking at impermanence for what it is, the reason why we suffer isn't because of impermanence, it's because we want things to stay the same. We want things to stop. So, okay, I see that decaying, but I'd like it to stop, please. And when the universe doesn't obey our desires, right, because the universe doesn't care about our desires, then of course, that's when we suffer. Right? Or sometimes we actually want things to decay faster, right? Sometimes we say, like, I don't like this situation, right? I want it to go away. I want it to go faster. I've got a cold. Right? Why can't this cold be over with? Why can't it be next week? right? Why can't I feel better? So sometimes we want, we like impermanence, but we want it to move along faster, right? So all of this is deluded thinking, right? And all of this deluded thinking causes us to suffer. Why can't this cold go away? Why is this, why did this have to change? Why did this have to happen to me? Right? Well, the reason why things happen to us is because things are always happening to us. Some of them we like, some of them we don't. Right? When we like them, we call that pleasure. When we don't like it, we call it suffering. Right? And all this is happening in our minds. Right? So if we look at things as being impermanent, then the next thing to notice is what our mind is doing to make us suffer because of it. Right? Because we don't look at it realistically, we look at it as if it was optional. And it's not. Right? So this is kind of the first step. Right? This is the most basic teaching of the Buddha is that, everything arises, everything ceases. Right? And if we realize that, if you take that far enough, you don't need any other teachings. You'll reach enlightenment because that's all you really need to know. Everything follows from that. Right? So everything that you've learned in Buddhism follows from impermanence. So the first line talks about the world is impermanent. Right? So, and everything obviously in it is impermanent. Nations are dangerous and fragile. So what does that mean? Yeah.
Well, a country is just kind of a country. It can just become a new one in a day, or countries form and break off of each other and stuff. And it can only lead to more problems, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they're trying to mean.
So
it's like a country isn't permanent because it can just be destroyed or replaced by another, or branch off. And, I think that's what they're trying to mean.
Yep, exactly. Right? And if you just look at the history of the world, if you look at the history of nations, they don't last longer than, maybe a few hundred years if they're lucky. Right? Less if that. Look at the Ukraine.
Yeah.
Right? So, country, then part of Russia, then independent, then not so much, and then breaking off Crimea, and then unstable. Right? How about Canada? Or North America? Are we stable?
Yeah.
Too bad.
Ford.
We are stable for now.
Ford Nation is not stable. How about dangerous?
When something is fragile, it's really not dangerous.
Right. We're, I wouldn't say we're at a disadvantage, but certainly in terms of understanding this concept, living in Canada, living in North America, we feel like, okay, other parts of the world are dangerous, right? If you live in Somalia, if you live in Afghanistan, if you live in Crimea, right? Then the concept of nations being dangerous and fragile makes more sense. But we kind of think, being in Canada, because things have been calm for a while, that it couldn't happen here. Right? It can't change here. But of course, everything is impermanent. All the conditions which lead things to be stable here can go away, and at that time it's no longer stable. If you look at what's happening in the States, right, with things like gun laws, with things like, did you guys hear about the news story with the rancher? Cliven Bundy. Right? Have you guys heard the story? So he's a rancher in, where is it?
Texas.
Don't think it was Texas, it was Montana or something like that. I don't know, somewhere out west. Right, so he decided he's been grazing his cattle on federal public land. Right? However, this gentleman is kind of independent, free spirit, sovereign citizen, believes that there is no such thing as the federal government, so therefore he doesn't have to pay fees to the federal government to graze on this land that he's been doing. And he actually owes the government about $1 million for over the last 20 years. But he said, well, I don't recognize the federal government, so I don't have to pay. And a lot of the right-wing people in the States, they kind of got behind this idea. They say, yeah, government's bad. Right? So the next thing you have is militia organizing themselves, showing up at his farm, at his town, that kind of thing. Right? And the next thing you have is basically an organized standoff, where you've got people, basically crazy people, militia with guns, You got government on the other side with guns, right? Very volatile situation. So like imagine living just in this small town out west somewhere, and all of a sudden you've got like potential armed conflict, right? The militia actually started setting up checkpoints, right? And they would stop you on the road and make you prove that you lived where you said you lived before they'd let you past, right? And if the government steps in, of course, then you have the potential for like conflict, for bloodshed, right? So the government is kind of paralyzed, right? They don't know what to do. And then you've got these people who are like basically willing to start shooting, or they say they do. So that happened over the course of 2 weeks, right? And luckily it's kind of diffused now, right? They're starting to leave, they're starting to move out, things like that. The situation is kind of over. But very quickly, that situation happened. Right? I thought you were going to say something.
Well, you look at Oka as well.
Oka,
I mean,
right?
there was
Another
a
good example.
conflict in Canada not too long ago with soldiers facing off with what we would conventionally call another country's terrorists, territorial separatists. So it's only an idea away.
This was on like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when they had a whole standoff with Via Rail.
Yep.
You don't hear as much about it, like, oh, for sure, all sorts of stuff.
So even some place that we think of as completely stable, right? How fragile is that? Right? How quickly could it go?
It gets pretty freaky when we have a huge blackout affecting a wide area, and everything we've relied on up to that point is electronic.
I forget where the quote comes from, but they say that any civilization is like 3 meals away from anarchy. Right? So imagine like, going to the store and like, there's no food, right? So like go for 3 days or 3 meals or whatever, and like think of the anarchy in the streets that there would be if there was like no food, right? Or no electricity, or if the internet goes down. Forget about 3 meals, like 15 minutes, and that would be it. So, okay.
That can't be impermanent, the internet.
Internet arose, it's abiding, eventually declines, right? Hopefully starting with Facebook, but that's another story. So all things arise, cease, change, and become different, right? So the next line says they are illusory, they're not real. They can't be controlled. So why do we say, and this is the first question here, so why do we say phenomena are illusionary or unreal? Because they're impermanent. Right, so let's do our groups again. We're running out of time, right? Okay, I apologize for that. So let's pick it up next week. We'll pick it up there. But think about that question, right? So when we talk about it being illusory, right, what's the relationship between that and impermanence? And we'll pick that up next week, and that's where we'll start.
And that fits in perfectly with the emptiness part of the suture you're going to get into for next week.
There you go.
That kind of leads into it a bit, I think.
Exactly. Okay. So a good place to stop. Thank you, everyone.